We're going to send it to you. And we would love for you to be inputting your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform today. So please try to focus through the Q&A platform your questions. And we're hoping that there'll be some time to do some Q&A live towards the end of the session. But please do put in your questions, and we'll try to write answers wherever we can as well. So we'll see you in the Q&A. We're going to be kicking off today's webinar with some examples of projects and initiatives that are going to get us thinking about the possibilities of reducing urban transportation emissions. And then we're going to dive into some specifics around our grant program guidelines. We're also going to start with a little bit of an overview about the Climate Innovation Fund itself. So before we begin our agenda, I would of course like to take some time for a land acknowledgement. In this last year, spending so much time working remotely and connecting with people through screens, we think it's more important than ever to remember and acknowledge the land and traditional territories that we're working from. And we often have people coming to us on Zoom from many different regions. So welcome. I'm joining today from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. And the city of Calgary, where I am, is also the home of Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Our other Alberta Ecotrust colleagues are located in Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory and is the traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. The city of Edmonton is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. As we collectively engage in our work to support a low carbon future, I invite us all to consider how we can learn from and honor the traditions and the people who were here before us, and also those who will come after us. And speaking of people, we've set up a way for you to meet one another and meet other attendees. So we're trying to foster some collaboration through a new tool. We've set up a board through a platform called Padlet for you to virtually leave a project business card of sorts. So we're trying this out as a way to create networking opportunities that we're hoping are a little more interactive than the Zoom chat box. So you can find the link to the Padlet board in the chat. And once you're on the board, you'll find a pink circle with a plus symbol. So you'll simply left click on that circle to add a post. And what can you put in that post? Your information, the organization name, your email. And if you have an idea for a project and you're open to finding possible project partners or collaborators, please put a little something about that project in your Padlet post. Now we're going to keep this board open throughout the webinar and after the webinar. So you'll be able to continue to populate it, find people you might want to collaborate with, and it's going to remain open until July 1st. So please take a moment just to put a little something in the Padlet. And before we hear from our first case study, I'm going to actually turn it over to Stephanie, my colleague Stephanie, for a brief introduction to Alberta Ecotrust and the Climate Innovation Fund to give us a bit of context. Stephanie, take it away.
Thanks, Vicki. So the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation was founded in 1991. We're an environmental charity that continues to be a critical source of funding and capacity building for the province's environmental nonprofit community. Alberta Ecotrust became a Low Carbon Cities Canada Centre last year, and the establishment of the Climate Innovation Fund is a natural fit for Alberta Ecotrust's suite of programming. Our Climate Innovation Fund delivers programming in Calgary and Edmonton with a $44 million one-time cash endowment provided by the federal government through a partnership with FCM. As an LC3 centre, we work collaboratively with other centres across Canada, with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and our local governments in Edmonton and Calgary. We take on a nimble accelerator role, complementing and advancing the leadership work undertaken by the municipalities. Our approach is evidence-based and data-driven. We focus on the major urban emission sources in Edmonton and Calgary, the building and transportation sectors. Both cities have a very similar emission profile, though Edmonton has a slightly larger industrial footprint. So through our work, our approach, we strive to train educate, build capacity, and develop policy while convening partnerships and amplifying the work of other climate programming in our communities through our strategic projects and programming. Our direct investment arm focuses on financing, credit enhancement, and impact investing. And then finally, through our grant program, which is our focus today, we fund local climate mitigation projects in Calgary and Edmonton, covering a diverse range of activities from technology demonstration to collective impact and policy advancement. Through our best practice research and stakeholder input, we've identified 3 focus areas of impact for urban climate solutions. So that's building better, retrofitting wiser, moving on mobility, decarbonization and renewable energy, and an overarching focus area looking at low carbon financing and measurement, verification, and offsetting. So within each of these focus areas, we have sub-priorities that are the target for our grant funding this year. So our previous webinar focused on building better and retrofitting wiser. Today, we're focusing on moving on mobility, and we have a 3rd webinar scheduled to talk about decarbonization and renewable energy. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to pass it back to Vicki, who will introduce our 2 case studies for today.
Thanks, Stephanie. We're excited to hear these case studies, and the intention of the case studies is to provide some examples of projects and initiatives that are taking place in Alberta and beyond that are really helping to address urban emissions. Our grant program, which is what you're here to learn about as well, could be used to fund complete projects, pieces of a larger project, or even to help catalyze a project that's in its early stages. Now, some of the case studies that you're going to hear are more aspirational in nature, because we're certainly thinking a lot about scale and how to scale projects here. So we're hoping they can spark some ideas of what might be possible to pursue in Calgary and Edmonton. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first speakers, Shawna Sylvester and Jude Crosta. Shawna Sylvester is a professor of professional practice and the executive director of Simon Fraser University's Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. She serves as a senior advisor to the Metro Vancouver Zero Emissions Innovation Center and is the lead convener of Cities on the Road to Glasgow. She has a passion for cities and has served as the lead facilitator for the Mayor's Task Force on Community Housing in Burnaby and Vancouver. And she's the convener of Moving in a Livable Region, a consortium of transportation and land use planning leaders in Metro Vancouver. Jude Crosta is the program manager for Moving in a Livable Region. He's a communicator, designer, strategist, and entrepreneur who likes to work on the front lines of head-scratcher projects that have larger social impact. Having partnered with different levels of government, he's worked on issues relating to transportation, infrastructure, education, spending, climate change, and innovation. As a passionate aviator, Jude is also looking to bring his skills as a pilot to expand the frontiers of sustainable mobility, innovation, and better support livability, goods movement, public services, and socioeconomic equity. I'll pass it over to Shawna and Jude to tell us more about Moving in a Livable Region initiatives. And welcome, Shawna and Jude, take it away.
Thanks so much, Vicki. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I am thrilled. LC3 is near and dear to my heart. I facilitated the very first dialogues that led to the creation of LC3. So I'm thrilled to be here and to be part of the thinking through all of this in Calgary and Edmonton, because we work so closely with Calgary and Edmonton with Carbon Talks, a project I funded. So over, Jude, we've had a chance to be introduced, but we want to get started with a few poll questions, I think, to get us going, just to ensure there's a bit of interactivity here. And I'm wondering, Stephanie, are we ready to go? Over to you, Jude.
Yeah, Stephanie, if you can have the poll up.
Yeah.
We just have a quick couple of questions for you folks. The first question being, before COVID, what was your primary form of transportation? How did you get around? Was it transit, active transportation, walking, cycling, or using a personal vehicle? And while we just get the answers in, this will be really quick. And if we can get the answers up. Right. The majority, over 50%, said a personal vehicle, with active transportation coming in a close second. Interesting. Transit being a third over there. It's contrast from Metro Vancouver. Okay, let's move quickly to our next question. What percentage of GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions, do cities emit in Canada?
Oh, next question. I think we're still
Oh,
on.
sorry.
I'm not a
Having
problem.
some technical difficulties.
If there's any technical difficulties, we'll just move on and we can keep going. If that works for you, Stephanie, we'll hold on the questions.
Oh,
But
I think I got it going now.
yeah, there we go.
Right. And if we, over here, 45%, 60%, 75% in terms of city GHG emissions.
This is kind of a trick question, isn't it, Jude?
Yes. It really depends on how you define cities.
So what do people have to say? Let's see.
60%.
So 38 at 60, which is where the Federation of Canadian Municipalities would say the number sits.
Yeah. And lastly, what percentage of Canadian emissions come from the transportation sector, according to the Government of Canada? This is a little more definite, and there's one right answer. Of course, there are people who would like the expansion of the transportation sector to be, the definition of transportation to be expanded. All right, and if we can see the results for that. The answer is actually 25%, according to Canada.ca from the most recent stats on the transportation sector. But yeah, so that's a quick exercise to get the mind going. If there is one thing you would like to learn from us today, go ahead and input that into the chat. That's our last question for you to think through while we're going through this presentation. Shawna.
Great, thanks, Jude. Now, what we want to do is give you a sense of what is moving in a livable region. Now, we started moving in a livable region in 2012 originally, and it started as all of the major transportation players. So think of our TransLink, our Mayor's Council, our business associations. We had unions around the table. Pretty well anyone that's focused on transportation and economic development were there. And the focus really in 2012 was, how do we pay for transportation? And how do we ensure that transportation is really supporting the economic development of our region? We are what's called a track two process, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But in 2012 to 2016, in this period, the government had a referendum and it said, we're not going to give any more money unless we get a referendum. And so the mayors had to come together, decide on the vision, and we then went through a referendum on more money for our vision for transportation. And unfortunately, we didn't win that referendum. All of the conditions were there that would not make it easy for us to win. So we closed down at about 2016. We had felt like we had done what we had set out to do, which was to bring those players together. And then we got a knock on the door in 2018, and the Mayor's Council on Transportation asked us to start again. We need you. We need this table. It was the only table where people would come into the room and not yell at each other. It was actually a really constructive group. So we went and we said, well, let's really make sure that this needs to happen this time. So we went and we talked to all of those players and then some. And this time the table was formed, and moving in a livable region wasn't just about mobility. It was tying mobility very close to your land use planning. And I don't think, looking at the participants, I have to explain why that is essential. But it also was looking at transportation through the lens of equity, economic development, health, and resilience. And we include climate within the context of resilience. And that was really what we became, a stakeholder-driven process, confidence-building exercise of all of the key stakeholders, including environmental growth organizations, active transportation, etc. Over to you.
And so, just to quickly go over how we operate as an initiative, we have a number of activities that we regularly undertake. The the majority of our activities are decided and stem from a consensus of stakeholders. The stakeholder cooperation, as Shawna mentioned before, follows a track 2 process. Those who have experience with diplomatic circles don't need an explanation for this, but essentially a track 2 process is a trust building exercise among the stakeholders that join us at that table. Important to that trust building is the ability for stakeholders to come in, remove the affiliate hats they're wearing from their organizations, and speak freely to the different topics, discussions, policies that come up at the table. We operate these meetings under the Chatham House rule, and all reporting that takes place from these meetings contain no attribution to the people who've provided the feedback. This has so far, this has been a very successful method of operation to decide what we do in the rest of our activities and the content that we undertake. But just to give you an overview, we do engage heavily in a lot of civic literacy activities, whether that's online or in print. Of course, in print became a little unfeasible with COVID, but online we've really taken on a variety of issues affecting the mobility landscape in different places we didn't think would be possible before COVID. We are launching a series of deliberative dialogues in communities to tackle not just yes or no, what do you think at the end of a consultation on different decision-making priorities, but we really go in, educate residents, identify and really surface those values and trade-offs they have that affect their perceptions of various developments that take place, policies, even just discussions of everything that goes around. And finally, we undertake a lot of general engagement. We've organized a federal all candidates forum, regionally for Metro Vancouver, a provincial one. We've had dialogues with the public, just open information sessions with experts on various issues, and we'll continue to do that further. Our goal when it comes to engaging the public is to provide information that's free and accessible, but also understand where they're coming from.
So we have a series of principles in how we operate, and I want to just go into those. The first is that we are always very transparent and fact-based. We're trying to work from an evidence base on where mobility fits. And so few people really think about transportation in their daily lives. The reality is we buy houses, we don't factor the cost of transportation in the house we purchase. And so part of what Moving in a Livable Region is doing is trying to give information and build our civic literacy on what's going on, and to do that on an evidence base. And that really creates an opportunity as well to bring new perspectives. So always trying to stay on that front edge of what we're learning about transportation. All of our materials have a high production value. That has in part due to the fantastic designer that Jude is, but we're really trying to help people process information as well. We never get into dictating or prescribing how people should think, for example, of mobility pricing. We're trying to enable them to come to their own judgment. And that's part of what we call this arc of engagement. We believe that people need to understand there's an issue. So that's public awareness. That's the first part of an arc of an engagement. Then they move into education. So they need to be provided with really good evidence-based information. And this is the part we often forget about. It's not until people mix their values with the information that they're learning about that they can really assess options for moving forward. It really has to sit with them. And that's what citizens provide, is that value-based trade-off. So that's the area of judgment. And when you can sit down at the dinner table and say, this is what I think about an issue, this is what I think about, transportation on any given day, that's when you're at the level of advocacy where you can articulate your own position to someone else. And then you can move to action. And so much we see in our world is about, we're going to raise awareness and get people to move and change behaviors. And that's not how it goes. And at the Center for Dialogue, we spent a lot of time in this arc of engagement.
And so when we're looking at some of LC3's priorities for the Climate Innovation Fund in Alberta, and when we look at the work that MLR regularly supports, we do have a lot of alignment. We understand that the priorities over here are building better, retrofitting wiser, moving on mobility, the topic we're talking about today, and decarbonization and renewable energy. When it comes to moving the livable region, our primary job is to support our stakeholders who are an amazing group of organizations that work in mobility and land use. A lot of the areas they work on are tying mobility dollars to land use, mode switching, getting people to move off of single occupancy vehicles into more public and active forms of transportation, ensuring that the support infrastructure for sustainable mobility is built, and the support infrastructure for better construction choices. Commercial switching of zero emission vehicle fleets is a very important issue. It's very prominent right now, even in our transportation authority. We do also have a lot of active transportation advocates at the table, raising the profile on not just building better cycling infrastructure, but also really taking a look at how we can reshape the Motor Vehicle Act in BC to switch from being car-centric to encompassing all forms of mobility, whether it's vehicle usage, transit, or active transportation. When we put all these topics together and really look at it holistically, and also incorporate new frontiers of mobility that come in, we find that we're starting to get a better picture that represents how people want to move. And then we find that we're setting ourselves up in a better place to engage the public, because that's where they see their mobility options lying, as opposed to something that we have to prescribe to them.
In the last couple of minutes, I just want to say a couple of things. I mean, so many of us, as we're looking at LC3, see this as grant making and go in for, will my project do this? One of the things I always say to our folks at the SFU, and we have a big climate solutions group and a big urban studies group, is I say, you know, in the act of convening, you can double, triple, quadruple your impact by bringing the key players along who have the capacity to make the change. So often we find ourselves moving to advocacy before we've actually convened the key players and built the kind of trust and understanding so that they will also be our validators and they will also be a part of the change. And one of the things, after doing this for 8 years, I cannot believe what it is like walking into a room where everybody respects everyone else. Doesn't matter what they do out in the public, working in the media, they'll do their thing. They have to represent their interests, their stakeholders. But in that room, they're looking for the best possible solutions for mobility, land use planning through the lens of health equity, economic development, and resilience. And that is the power of MLR. That's it for us. I think we're out of time, but Stephanie, we would love to hear stories and know if this resonates for anybody here in Edmonton or in Calgary. Does this kind of convening, this trust building exercise work, and does it resonate for you?
Oh, thank you so much, Shawna and Jude. That's great and very inspiring, actually, to think about coming together in that way. So thank you so much for that presentation, and feel free, folks, in the chat to respond to Shawna's question. Does that resonate? How does that resonate? And also, please feel free to remember to direct your questions through the Q&A, and feel free to do that whenever you'd like. We're going to move on to our next. Thanks again to Shawna and Jude for setting us up in such an inspiring way. We're going to move to our second case study. So I'd like to introduce Liliana Vargas, Business Development Manager, and Shawna Rector-Bleeker, Co-founder and Partnerships Manager, both of 7 Generation Capital. Liliana Vargas is an experienced transportation professional with experience in Alberta and BC municipalities and the private sector. Liliana integrates transportation planning and engineering principles to accelerate transportation decarbonization from the ground up, and supports a financially feasible transition to a low carbon way of moving people and goods. Shawna Rector-Bleeker is a former communications executive with multinational Shell and the City of Vancouver. Shawna is experienced at developing partnerships and managing complex stakeholder projects. She represents 7 Generation Capital in working groups and associations like the Pembina Urban Delivery Sustainability Initiative and Global Drive to Zero. So I'll turn it over to Shawna and Liliana to tell us a bit about their work with 7 Generation Capital. Take it away. Do we have, oh, there you are, Liliana.
I am here, but Shawna, we can't hear you.
No. Well, let's try to figure out. Oh, Shawna appears to have found her way into the attendee list. So I don't know, Stephanie, you may be able to invite her back
Sure,
onto
yeah,
the
let's
panel.
pull Shawna back into the panelist. Give us
That
one
might be
moment,
why we
please.
can't hear her.
Apologies.
No worries. I should have come up with a technical sort of hold song.
Hello, hello. Does that work?
Okay,
Hi,
there we go.
Welcome. So I'll hand it over to Shawna and Liliana. Take it away.
Yeah. Goes really well because, as Shawna concluded at the end there, you know, the time spent convening and same paging really pays dividends then once you want to get to action. So I'm here to present our company, which is a Vancouver-based startup, 7 Generation Capital, just to awaken your minds, those of you that work for organizations that are moving people and goods around. Awaken you to the opportunity of how we might decarbonize those and tell you a little bit about the work we have been doing this year to help make that simpler. The why behind all of this is, you know, we've set these net zero targets. Now we're doing the hard work of how to get there. Thank you, whoever's driving the slides. So we're effectively acting as a partner in electrification. We are technology agnostic and we're helping companies' fleets navigate both the charger or the infrastructure side and what vehicles meet their needs, as well as a final piece of the puzzle, which is assembling the financing. To date, there's not a lot of leasing providers that will provide a lease opportunity for electric vehicles. The why being, we haven't proven out what the future or residual values of those are because there haven't been many of these vehicles on the road. So we've spent the last year just trying to figure out that messy puzzle. Next slide, please. Those of you that have been or are working in the climate space will clearly know the transition and the imperative for we as a country and as individual provinces and cities have set really ambitious net zero targets, as have a number of companies. And as you can see on the map there, it shows where targets are still in discussion and where they're actually becoming law. Next slide. The thing that's changed really in the last couple of years has been not only do we have the Teslas on the road or the Nissan Leafs, but in fact, there's a number of larger commercial vehicles available. And as per Jude's survey in the last session, transportation is a quarter of our emissions in Canada. So the raison d'etre, or the reason our team has come together is, you know, it's one thing to have technology and is another to do the hard work of actually accelerating the deployment of it. And what's wonderful to note as well is there's even a number of Canadian producers in the medium and heavy duty space. So in addition to creating cleaner air for our employees in the communities we live and work in, we have an opportunity to deploy Canadian technology here. Next slide. I'm going to be really quick here because I want to get to the points that are relevant for you as an audience. But just to paint a picture of the team that I'm here representing and the sorts of stuff we do, we help organizations just map, okay, what are your greenhouse gas targets and how might electrification happen for you? As I mentioned before, we help on the charging infrastructure and vehicle side. Plus, there's a little bit of software and operational efficiency that needs to be added. And lastly, this is an emerging policy space. And I think as most of you are based in Alberta, you'll recognize that the space has been changing quite a lot in recent years, and navigating where the incentives are and where the regulation is coming is a piece of work in and of itself. Next. Just to paint a picture for some of the organizations we work with. So for those of you that are thinking about the mobility pillar of what this grant can help with, there's Global Drive to Zero commitments. Canadian-based Pembina has a great working group that's specifically focused on reducing emissions in our cities through its Urban Delivery Sustainability Initiative. And then specifically, we're working in provinces with industry associations. So here in BC, for example, with the Trucking Association and with a major decision maker around where municipal waste contracts go, and that's Recycle BC. Bridging back to the previous conversation, when we're shifting entire ecosystems, it really does require a convening approach and partnership approach. And I think that's the beautiful thing about the work that Ecotrust Alberta is trying to do with grants like this. They can help in that convening piece that will help get the same page for these system shifts to happen. Next slide, please. It's a wide audience on this call here, so some of you may be early in thinking through the EV journey, others may have a sense of the vehicles that are available, and others may have immediate vehicle replacement pressures and are debating that, do we do another 10-year internal combustion engine vehicle or EV? Wherever clients and partners are in the journey, we've assembled a team that can meet where they are. Next slide. I'm going to skip past this one pretty quickly, but just to say there's a very big opportunity for Canada as a country to be a world leader in this electrification space, just given we sort of operate up and down the supply chain. If there are folks seriously, next slide works, seriously thinking about decarbonizing your fleets, there is a new municipal incentive, municipal climate action incentive in Alberta, which you can look to as steps that need to be taken to actually. It's frozen.
Sorry, Shawna, I think you may have frozen, at least on my end.
Yeah, are you on to the next one?
Okay,
yeah,
there we go.
On mine as well. There we go. The conclusion here. So, the how we approach things, really we develop and help groups map their own EV roadmaps. We then look at interest to those on this call. And I'll give you the example, downtown area, they might wish to use public lands or a not-for-profit to a couple of fleets. That's a way of bringing down the infrastructure costs for those that are participating. And longer term down the line, this could even become a case of where we're able to match and aggregate those that have access to land and those that are driving fleets to have almost a community-based asset of sort, fueling transportation from the traditional fuel suppliers to a more disaggregated model. So I wouldn't purport to say we're there now, but I would say that is an exciting opportunity down the line once electrification hits some sort of a scale. Last slide there. So just in thinking how the LC3 and the Alberta Ecotrust grant could apply, if you're earlier in your journey, it could help to do an electrification path study of sorts. So just what greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets could realistically be achieved with what level of investment. If you've already done it, present itself where we could help, and that would be in understanding really specifically the investment opportunities, how groups like ours could bring some of the private capital we've managed to mobilize to be interested to support organizations to electrify. So if either of those things interest, Liliana and I would be delighted to help you think through what an application could look like. And just on this last slide, I provide a couple of resources. I mentioned Pembina already. Of course, Ecotrust Alberta has done a wonderful piece of landscape mapping around various sectors, including the moving and mobility pillar. And just even last week, the city of Edmonton put out a very robust energy transition strategy. So to figure out how your investments and efforts might fit into bigger ecosystem plays, there's a lot of great stuff going on, and we'd be delighted to help.
Great. Thanks, Shawna and Liliana. Is that your presentation? Just want to make sure we didn't. Awesome. I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss Liliana. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for providing your contact information so folks can follow up and find out more. And thank you so much for being here. And I want to again invite everyone to include any questions you might have in the Q&A portion of the Zoom. And we're hoping we can get to some Q&A, some live Q&A, and sort of answer some questions, but please do put any questions you have in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And but before we get to the questions, we're going to actually dive in a little bit deeper, and thank you again to all of our presenters. We're going to dive in a little bit deeper into the Moving on Mobility focus area and the Climate Innovation Fund grant. And so I'm going to invite my colleague, Jessica, to come on over and tell us a little bit about that before we answer some questions, hopefully. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Vicki. And thank you for those presentations. They were very inspiring, and I know Stephanie worked hard to come up with some great case studies for us today, so I really enjoyed those. Thank you. All right, so we'll move on with our sub-priorities for our focus area Moving on Mobility. The first is shared mobility, micromobility, and active transportation. And by this, we mean projects that explore different ways of moving around that will reduce fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions. And for example, this could be vehicle sharing models or projects to encourage and enable the use of e-scooters or e-bikes. The second is energy management systems to support electrification. So we just heard how important electric vehicles will be to our decarbonized future. So here we're targeting projects that address the infrastructure barriers to widespread vehicle electrification. And this can be addressed through grid management technology or studying the critical upgrades that will need to be undertaken. Our third sub-priority is reducing the impact of urban freight, which has also been touched on already. And this is around goods delivery, goods and services in our cities, which is a growing area of economic activity, but also greenhouse gas emissions. Other urban centers and cities are exploring new ways of providing freight services, and we're eager to learn more about what solutions might apply in Calgary and Edmonton. And next slide, please. All right, so we can go through just a few not exclusive or all-inclusive list of potential projects. So we can fund things like studies around addressing mobility barriers or increasing access to micromobility, shared mobility, and particularly for underserved demographics. Low-cost capital projects at the community level to promote active transportation. Things like energy management system pilots, again, around that grid limits and barriers to electrification. So things that manage electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And as well, we can fund policy, research, and studies, particularly that assess barriers for large-scale rapid electrification. This could include neighborhood servicing standards, which is the delivery of sufficient electricity infrastructure to neighborhoods for when vehicles are part of that electrical grid. And as well, we can do studies or demonstrations, pilot projects on low or no emissions goods and services movements or other types of vehicles as well, or sorry, projects as well. And finally, we could consider a capital contribution to a fleet conversion initiative, knowing that the amounts we have may not be sufficient, but we were happy to come in on a project that has other funders and be part of that. Great. All right, let's move on. So another thing I'm going to talk about now is one of our project eligibility criteria is around greenhouse gas emission reductions. And this is a bit complicated in the transportation sector because there's so many tiny point sources and so many decisions being made that that contribute to transportation emissions. So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so just a little bit of background for anyone who's not familiar or hasn't done greenhouse gas impact quantification before. Really, the way we look at it is what would have happened in the absence of your project, and how does your project change the kind of the future trajectory that we were on prior to you putting that project together? So there's a forecasted growth in emissions typically, and we really want to see that dip or that turning the curve on where emissions are going. So applicants will need to demonstrate a change to business as usual or baseline activities. And the change in emissions is what constitutes your greenhouse gas emission reductions. All right, so around how we determine greenhouse gas impact, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction pathway for urban transportation is achieved through addressing the consumption of fossil fuels, which are, in our case, in urban centers, primarily gasoline and diesel. And this is usually on-road transportation, although I understand there's off-road emissions as well. The scale and or amount of fossil fuels reduced can be estimated by how much the use of these fuels is affected by the project, either through reducing the amount of actual kilometers traveled or trips taken, or shifting how those trips are taken to a lower emitting option. So typically this is from a single person in a private vehicle to active modes, transit, and ultimately even switching the fuel that trip is taken with to electrification or lower carbon fuels that are being explored right now. The applicant should also consider, because we have a requirement to look at the scale, what is the potential market for the project and what would that project ultimately work towards in terms of scaling up for potential. So whether it's, again, shifting personal travel or commuting habits, increasing transit ridership, or facilitating those switches to lower carbon fuels. I can say that Ecotrust is committed to calculating our emission factors using, or our emission reductions using published emission factors. We're very transparent on this. We're happy to share our processes. And in terms of how we scale up a project, we know that based on our funding, our projects, be limited in size. And how we scale those up, we'll be working with the cities of Edmonton and Calgary to get specific data. They do tons of research on how people travel, where trips are taken, et cetera, and have very complicated models. As well as much of the research and reports that have been written on the impact of projects to address transportation emissions in other jurisdictions. So we're happy to include those in our research as well. All right, next slide, I think. Right. So the team here at the Climate Innovation Fund has been working on localizing the National Low Carbon Cities, or LC3, that you've heard mentioned, their methodology for determining greenhouse gas reductions. So there are two types of essentially numbers that we'll be generating for projects. These will be direct emission reductions, which is directly from the funded project, any impact to emissions, and we'll calculate these over a 7-year scale. If there are any, if it's a study or a research project, there may not be any direct emission reductions. But then that's why we also want to consider the potential for greenhouse gas reductions if that project were scaled up, and we would look at that impact over a 20-year scale. Other things we want to consider are current trends in the market. Again, we heard a lot about what's happening with electric vehicles. I, for one, keep seeing ads for the new Ford F-150 Lightning. It seems crazy to me that that's out on the market now. So we do want to consider where trends are going so that projects are actually going beyond business as usual. So we'll help with that as well. And a note on life cycle impacts. Often this can come into play maybe when you have a fuel switching. So people might say, oh, electrification in Alberta doesn't work because there's coal-fired electricity on the grid. So we aren't specifically looking at life cycle impacts at this stage, but we are cognizant of that. We want to fund projects that do have an overall positive impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll look into that on a project by project basis, whether emissions are just shifted somewhere else or whether there's an actual reduction overall. And of course, Ecotrust staff are here to help applicants through this greenhouse gas reduction portion of any applications that they'll be submitting. And last slide. So I just wanted to quickly show you how we're working behind the scenes to make this a bit easier. We're developing a carbon benefit estimator. Calculator might be too strong a word since we're using a lot of assumptions and default factors, but really we want to be consistent in our assumptions and our approach used to develop these greenhouse gas reduction estimations for both the project and the scale up scenarios. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Stephanie, and she's going to talk about our grant eligibility details. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. So to wrap up this final section, we're just going to be going through the general eligibility details for the grant program. So in terms of eligible recipients, qualified Canadian donees and nonprofit associations. So this includes community associations, industry business associations, First Nations undertaking projects in Calgary and Edmonton, school boards, post-secondary institutions, and the cities of Calgary and Edmonton. For-profit and private sector entities could be eligible provided they partner with a charitable nonprofit organization who acts as the lead nonprofit. For eligible projects, so one application per organization per city per year will be accepted. Projects must result in direct project level and or projected greenhouse gas reductions, emissions at scale over 20 years. And this is one of the metrics that we'll be evaluating projects on. Activities and benefits must occur in Calgary or Edmonton. Projects must have a matching of 20% funding. And this is excluding federal sources, but it could include additional funding sources. And matching funding cannot be from the Canadian Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Non-cash contributions such as salaries can be used as matching funding provided they are audible expenses. Projects should align with the respective city's climate plan and or the goal of achieving carbon neutrality and articulate a clear pathway to scaling up of the initiative. And as we mentioned, they can cover a wide range of activities from technology demonstration to collective impact, policy, business cases, that sort of thing. And projects must be completed within 24 months of the start date. Of course, shorter proposals can be put forward. Ineligible projects include those without a measurable or projected greenhouse gas emission reduction, broad awareness or educational campaigns, standing alone. Of course, if there's education and awareness built into a project, that's completely fine. Redistributing funds as grants or rebates, marketing, surveying, polling, or advertising, single one-off technology deployment without an appropriate scale approach or scaling across a demographic or a sector, and then finally community gardens. So these are the available grant funding that we have in both cities. Calgary, 425,000, and Edmonton, about 550,000. Now, to calibrate the grant call, we're anticipating funding requests in the range of 10 to 50,000, and we will accept applications for potential up to 100,000 if the project meets or exceeds the evaluation criteria across multiple categories, but we would ask that you reach out to chat with us before submitting. This is just a brief timeline. So we have our final webinar coming up on June 16th, and then our portal for expressions of interest will open on July 1st, closing on July 30th. At that point, the staff will screen applications in August, and those that are successful will be invited to submit a full application. The full application will require additional project and budget information, and applicants will work directly with our team to quantify their project's greenhouse gas emissions reductions. An interview may be a requirement of the full application stage. The final decision-making authority on full applications will be delegated to the grant selection committee in each city, who will evaluate the projects using our evaluation criteria, which I'll talk about briefly, but is also available on our website. So just to kind of reiterate those project requirements, this is at a minimum. Must have that 20% matching funding, which is non-federal. Projects must align with respective city's climate plan, must align with one of our focus areas and sub-priorities, and the project proponents should demonstrate sufficient capacity, such as staffs and resources, to complete the project successfully. So for the evaluation criteria, we have 4 general categories. First is the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So this is either at the project level or at scale, and this is either direct or potential. And the weighting is the highest for this category. So projects that, such as a study, will look to calculate reductions based on the greenhouse gas reduction potential if the project study is implemented. For scale potential, we want to see the identification of the scale pathways that'll be integrated in the approach to widespread adoption, the ability to replicate the project or concept and scale up in avoiding carbon locking. The third category is co-benefits. So this is looking at job creation, community prosperity, and focus on economic development. Looking at social and community benefits, how does the project contribute to health, well-being, and safety? To what extent might the project improve mental health, physical health, spiritual well-being, or improve access to something like public health care? Third is looking at environmental. So does the project contribute to a healthy environment, such as protecting or promoting biodiversity, conserving habitat, reducing air pollution, that sort of thing? And the final bucket is equity. So considering how does the project consider distributional, procedural, and or recognitional equity dimensions. And our scorecard, which is based on the evaluation criteria, is available on our website if you'd like to see that in more details. So with that, I think we have about 4 minutes for any additional questions, and then we'll do a couple of minutes for questions and then maybe 1 minute for wrap up.
Indeed. So thanks everyone again, and thanks Stephanie, and thanks Jessica for sharing a little bit with us about the program itself and moving on mobility. And I'm not sure if there's any questions pending in the Q&A, but I will ask my colleague Simon Irving. Were there any questions that came up that you would like to highlight, Simon?
Hi, Vicky. Yeah, so no open questions currently in the Q&A, but there were just a couple in there. So I think folks would have been able to see them as they were popping up. Certainly one around funding that's applicable for school education programs, which we would say are generally not eligible, although they would likely be eligible under our environmental grant program. So just a different grant program that we have at Ecotrust. However, if there is a school board level project or a school project that is scalable across the school board or something to that, so we can take round for the year for this year, and then we're just in discussion about how many we'll have moving forward for next year.
Thanks so much, Simon, and thanks, Rebecca, for that question. If there's no other questions, I think we'll do some wrap up. And knowing that we would love to hear from you, any of our attendees, the grants team, you can get in touch with the grants team and the Climate Innovation Fund team whenever you'd like to ask questions, to learn a little bit more. And thank you so much for being here today, everyone. And I want to say a special thank you to Shawna and Jude and Liliana and Shayna for being here and sharing some of the great ideas that they've had. And we're really looking forward to hearing the great ideas that are percolating out there. So just a reminder about to put up a project business card, or haven't had a chance to go view them, please take a look there. And reach out if you have any questions or you want to discuss your project. And we are going to send out a little post-session survey with the recording of this session and the copy of the slides. So we'd love to hear from you about what you thought of today's session, especially in advance of our next session, which, as was mentioned, is going to be June 16th and is on the focus area decarbonization. So for the next webinar, we're going to stick to this base, to the format of having our speaker and focus area specific. Returning attendees can opt out of hearing a repeat of the general grant information. Thank you again so much for being here. We can't wait again so much for being here. Can't wait to hear what you're